So, Samuel, you're the head of the Orange County Democratic Party. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and some of your legislative priorities?
Yeah, the Orange County Democratic Party focuses primarily on making sure we elect Democrats up and down the ballot. Here in Orange County is a county of 1.4 million people in the heart of Central Florida. And we train, recruit, and support candidates that are running in different positions, all the way from president, all the way down to school board members and city commissioners. We currently have 56 Democratic elected officials in Orange County, and we hope that by the end of this election cycle, we'll have over 60. So definitely a lot of work to make sure that our voters understand what's at stake in this election and ensuring that they know the record for all the candidates that will be on their ballot.
So I think that's a big focus that we have at the Digital Democracy Project, is making sure that we have a record of how everybody votes. Can you tell us about some of the important legislation that's come through that you think maybe we got right or got wrong?
We have had a very interesting past two legislative sessions here in Florida, where we've seen extremism be legalized in different capacities, in different laws, from a total 6-week abortion ban to book banning, to redesigning African American history, to preempting local governments, to defunding our public schools and funding voucher programs, to getting rid of environmental protections, to denying workers, in the farm workers particularly, protections, to targeting unions. We've seen tens, if not hundreds, of laws passed and enacted that are harmful to Floridians, that are harmful to our workers, and that, quite honestly, are harmful to our democracy. And it is pretty shameful to see how the current legislative supermajority has utilized Florida as a test lab to advance their anti-democratic policies and utilize it kind of to spread it around the country. So we are really concerned with what we've seen coming from Tallahassee. And that's exactly why we've been working super hard to deliver some victories at the legislative levels, flip several seats that are based here in Orange County.
So you had mentioned a lot of issues. You had mentioned something about a 6-week abortion ban. I think, that goes into effect today, correct?
Yeah, the 6-week abortion ban goes into effect today, May 1st, and it will have detrimental consequences on the healthcare of many women across the state who will no longer be able to make their own decisions over their body. And quite honestly, it will also have pretty detrimental effects on healthcare providers that will be having to choose between providing the care that is needed for women, in many cases, to survive, and the law. And quite honestly, this is a pretty extremist piece of legislation that got almost unanimous support from the Republican legislators in Tallahassee, and today gets enacted. Luckily, at least Floridians will have a say in November with Amendment 4. If Amendment 4 is passed with 60% of the vote, then abortion care in Florida will be legalized until the point of viability.
Now, that amendment, is that an amendment to the law or is that to the state constitution?
Amendment 4 will be an amendment to the state's constitution, and it will enshrine abortion care as a legal right for Floridians to utilize.
Wow, interesting. So if that ballot measure were to pass and you amended your constitution, would that immediately nullify the law, or would it require the law to then be repealed?
Correct. So Amendment 4 will immediately nullify the law. However, it's important that we elect a legislature that will stand and protect the majority of Floridians to vote for Amendment 4. We've seen in past years how the legislature has actually gone against the will of the people when we've passed similar constitutional amendments in the past, and they've come back through the legislature to nullify pieces of those particular amendments. So it's not enough to just pass Amendment 4. you have to elect a legislature that will be willing uh, to ensure and protect the voice of the majority, fully enshrine abortion care as a right in Florida.
So I had heard something about you had just recently passed a law in Florida that was purging maybe it wasn't a law, but some voter rolls just got purged, and it had something to do especially with mail-in voting. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So recently, I believe it was last year, we had a new voting rights bill passed into law by the Florida legislature. And basically, what it actually did is it made everyone have to sign up to vote by mail every cycle rather than every 4 years. And that's basically because Democrats tend to vote by mail, and they wanted to limit the way people vote and make sure that people have to re-enroll for vote by mail every 2 years. And then the other thing it did is it changed the way we looked at voter registration. And if voters don't vote within a cycle, they're moved into the inactive role. People in the inactive role can still show up on election day and vote, but if they don't show up in the next election, they'll be fully removed before the next election. So if somebody's an inactive voter because they didn't vote in 2022, in 2024, if they don't vote, they wouldn't be able to vote in 2026, but they can still vote in 2024.
That's an interesting point. I didn't think about that. For some reason, my mind went to the federal scale, and it was if you didn't vote in 2020, maybe you couldn't vote in 2024. But it seems that they're doing it on a state vote basis, so it's every 2 years.
Correct. It's every 2 years to be moved into inactive, but it's every 4 years in order for you to be fully purged out of the rolls.
So, as I understand it, I think in the long view of history, I think that it was normally the Republicans who did better with mail-in voting historically. And then after COVID, a lot of Democrats did the mail-in voting at a much higher rate than Republicans. Do you feel like now that COVID is not taken as seriously, that maybe that trend will shift back to Republicans doing more mail-in voting, or do you think mail-in voting is kind of something here to stay?
I think mail-in voting is something that it's here to stay. It's been part of our state law for decades, and historically it's been utilized by Republicans. I think obviously we'll see less mail-in voting now that COVID is gone. But what I always tell people is you rather have your vote by mail, and then if still you want to vote in person, you bring it to the polling location and submit it. Because if something was to happen, say you get sick, you have to travel for work, you're not going to be able to make the polling location, you can always make sure that your vote actually counts and you send it in via the mail. Now, a lot of people have concerns in terms of, is it actually going to be counted? Actually, here in Florida, every supervisor of elections has a ballot tracker online that you can actually follow. You can also call the supervisor of elections and ask if your ballot has been counted. And quite honestly, the rate of signatures not being approved or verified is extremely low. We're talking about 0.01%, at least here in Orange County. So
Wow,
voting
that
by
is
mail is safe, it's easy, and it's free. You don't have to pay for postage. You just have to put in your vote and your vote by mail. Especially important for the general election, where we're going to have a pretty long ballot with a lot of state amendments, local amendments, and then candidates up and down the ballot. What we've seen in the past is in general elections, especially in the presidential years, we see long lines during early voting on election day because the ballot is so long. So again, vote by mail allows you to actually be able to cast your vote from the comfort of your home, be able to look up candidates as you're filling out the ballot, and it's extremely safe to do here in Florida.
That's really interesting that you have a tracking mechanism to tell you whether or not your vote's been counted. I think that doesn't exist in all states, correct?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I thought so. So having a constitutional amendment on the ballot coming up, that's probably going to really increase turnout, I would presume. So I guess that might be another good idea to mail in your vote as well, is in case the lines are too long, you have to get back to work, or something were to happen on that day. So you said even if you mail in your ballot, you can bring your mail-in ballot to the polling location?
So there are several ways. Each county does it differently. If you go to early vote and you bring your vote by mail ballot, in many counties, like here in Orange County, you can just drop it off outside of the polling location, and then you secure that they have received your ballot. If you have it and you're going to vote in person on election day, you bring your vote by mail ballot, and then you're given a new ballot, and then you vote a regular ballot. So they don't necessarily take it, but you can return it, and they'll give you a regular ballot for you to vote.
I see, and that's presuming you haven't mailed it in yet.
Correct.
Okay,
Once you
I
mail
see.
it in, then you voted already.
So there was another issue that you had mentioned earlier. I think you were saying that they had passed some laws that were preempting local governments. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
There's been several laws preempting local government in Florida. For instance, here in Orange County, we passed the rent stabilization local amendment in 2022. And in 2023, the legislature went and decided that rent stabilization programs were against the law. And they passed a completely new law to prevent any form of rent stabilization. And mind you, the rent stabilization issue here actually had a lot of Republican support. It did better than our Democratic candidates here in Orange County. And that tells you enough about how much of an affordability crisis Floridians are facing. The other issue that recently came up, our local Charter Review Commission was studying placing some guardrails around rural settlements and building and development in rural areas. And literally days before the end of this past legislative session, the legislature came and passed a bill to preempt local governments from establishing certain regulations around rural development. And that is basically to support the developers who want to continue developing in our rural land. And we have seen similar issue after issue preempted from the state legislature.
Yeah, I think another one that I heard about was that local governments couldn't make changes to the state standards on how many breaks you get, or if it's too hot outside, how much water you get, or something like that.
Correct. So Miami-Dade and other counties had moved to protect farm workers from heat strokes, since farm workers are always outside, and they had basically provided some guidelines in terms of how much time a worker could be outside before they required a break and actually come in, drink some water, and come back. And the legislature preempted that this year as well.
That seems cruel. Okay, so it's interesting because historically it's always been kind of a Republican argument that the federal government shouldn't do so much and that they should allow the states to kind of be free and make their own decisions. There was this idea that you should be able to kind of govern your own way. Why do you think they've gone against that principle and now they are preempting local governments? In a way, they're almost treating their state government as a federalized top-down solution as opposed to allowing these smaller democracies to make their own decisions.
I think what we've seen here in Florida is an extremist state government that will have their way no matter what, and that will protect corporations without any care for workers and people, and that will advance an extreme social agenda that has taken us back decades in terms of the rights that people have here in Florida. And they are willing to get their agenda accomplished no matter what. This is no longer a rational argument in terms of allowing local communities to have the representation they need and the local governments to do what it's best for their communities, as many people claim in the argument of state rights over a strong federal government. It is no longer about whether a piece of legislation is good for our economy or actually incentivizes new jobs and new businesses to be created. It is no longer about the type of Florida we're trying to build. It is fully about making sure that first, whatever DeSantis wants happens. Second, whatever Donald Trump wants happens. And so I tend to think that Floridians are pretty tired of that extremist agenda, and that we'll see in November a coalition of Democrats, independents, and even some moderate Republicans come together and say enough and break the Republican supermajority in Tallahassee.
So you had said something interesting. You said that the past legislation, even if it's not good for the economy, I think I read an article the other day that Florida had just passed one of the most restrictive immigration bills in the country, and that they estimated that they were going to lose, I think it was a little over $12 billion in revenue over the next year. Why do you think they did that?
Again, I think the SB 1718, which is the immigration law that was passed last year, clearly demonstrated what was valuable for the governor and the legislature. And that was basically his political career and his presidential dreams. The reality is that immigrants have been the backbone of Florida's economy. Over 60% of all of our workers in the agricultural sector are actually immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. And DeSantis and the legislature passed an E-Verify mandate that has had detrimental effect in our economy, in particular industries like agriculture, tourism, hospitality, and even construction that have faced a lot of issues hiring because of the new immigration law. By the time when this law was passed, we had a 2.7% unemployment rate. And what it meant is for every 60 Floridians applying for jobs, there were actually 100 available jobs. And so the question was, where are our businesses going to get the workers they need in order for us to continue growing our economy? Well, that didn't matter because the economy was not a priority for DeSantis and the legislature. Making sure that DeSantis could one day be president was actually their priority. And we all suffer the consequences of that. Florida has the highest inflation rate in the whole country. We hear conservatives talk about the inflation crisis and blame President Biden. But the reality is Florida's inflation is twice as much as the inflation in the rest of the country. And primarily because of we have a housing affordability crisis. And part of the reason we have a housing affordability crisis is because we don't have enough housing. And so why would you, in the wake of a housing affordability crisis, target the construction companies, particularly the immigrants who work in the construction companies, that could actually allow you to get out of the housing affordability crisis? Because they didn't care about the housing affordability crisis.
So I also hear that you have an issue with property insurance. Is that around hurricanes and flooding? Is that some of the problems that you're having with the insurance policies?
We have a lot of problems with our property insurance, particularly around hurricanes and the policies and what is covered and what is not covered. This is a problem that we have not seen in any other state, and it's a problem that has been caused by a one-party government that has been in power for 30 years here in Florida, and we have seen no solution. The solutions that are coming down from Tallahassee, instead of strengthening our property insurance market, actually goes against consumers. So instead of saying we're going to figure out how to get more insurance companies to come to Florida, they say we're going to make it harder for homeowners to sue to get back the money they've been paying for through their insurance when something happens. So we not only have a property insurance crisis, people have seen their rates go up twice, but we also have a government that is actively working against consumers who need the protections against these companies that are basically trying to leave the state and not provide any coverage.
So if enough companies leave, do you think that it's incumbent on the federal government to do something about it? Do you think maybe there needs to be a federal solution here? Or do you think this is something that can be solved at a state level?
The problem is that every time the federal government has tried to help our state government, the help has been rejected, right? Like we've seen it on an issue like Medicaid. 38 states have actually expanded Medicaid usage, and the federal government provides 9 out of every $10 that gets spent on Medicaid coverage. And here in the state of Florida, we have continuously refused the federal government's help in making sure our people are insured, medically insured. And it's going to be the same issue. Whatever it is, the state government, because of politics, will continue to choose their politics before providing solutions to the problems people are facing. Another example of that is around transportation. The federal government has come to the state government, not only now, but years before, even when Obama was president, to say, we're willing to do match programs for you to build out your public transit, trains that connect the state, that make businesses and doing business in Florida a lot easier. And the state government has said no. So I have no sort of expectation that if the federal government wanted to step in and help in terms of our property insurance crisis, the state of Florida will actually take the help. And sure, you could say, the federal government should just pass a federal law. But the reality is that the problems we're facing here in Florida are just Florida specific. They're not affecting people everywhere else. And what people need to question is, why is it that everything here in Florida is more expensive?
That's a really good point. I feel like we've talked about a lot of issues here in this short time. And whether you identify as a Democrat or whether you identify as a Republican, whether you identify as a progressive or whether you identify as a conservative, it feels like a lot of these issues seem to really hit kind of the heart of what it is to be a Floridian. And I think a lot of people would agree with a lot of what you're saying. What do you think something like the Digital Democracy Project might be able to do to help?
I think it's super important for people to pay attention to how their legislators are voting on particular issues. And I think the Digital Democracy Project facilitates that process of attaining information for regular voters who might not have time to actually go in the news and figure out every bill and what it means, and then how their legislators voted, and provide that feedback to the legislator. And I think, again, the digital democracy process, in a way, helps democratize our legislative process here in the state of Florida, at least.
That's certainly our goal. I mean, I think, like I said, I think a lot of people would agree with a lot of the things that you're saying. I think a lot of people would acknowledge a lot of the problems that we're having. And I feel like maybe one of the reasons that, things aren't changing as quickly is because people aren't aware of the laws that are being passed and the things that could be done. They're not aware of the good ideas that are coming out from legislators trying to react to changing situations on the ground. So what we're really hoping to bring is public education. We want everybody to understand the problems that they face on a local level, on a state level, on a federal level, at every level that they're interested in, and we want them to be more and more involved. Well, Samuel, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope in the future we can have another conversation.